The countdown suddenly seems a little bit more tangible these days because we're actually talking about days and not weeks or months. Oklahoma football hits the field, we believe, we hope, next Saturday, as scheduled in Tulane. That's a conversation here for a little bit later as we talk Oklahoma football, of course, with you over the next hour, courtesy Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. So, folks, hope you appreciate what Jason brings in particular. And we hear the voice of college football bring it every week with Oklahoma discussion on Friday. We do have an announced schedule change for our in-season show. And, of course, Jason's going to be here after every OU contest. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Yeah, just like you mentioned, it's the days are numbered, specifically when it comes to just overall college football starts, in less than 24 hours, obviously, and then the Oklahoma season gets kicked off in about a week. But before, we talk a lot of Oklahoma football here, and before we dive in, just wanted everybody that's on here and everybody that will watch this video, specifically we talk about the Oklahoma side of things. We get into some things nationally, but if you haven't had an opportunity, for everybody watching here, take a look at when you got a chance over the next day or two. Take a look at Mark's video with Josh Pate. Great stuff. Just over the entire where we came from 2020 with the COVID year, and some of the big topics that we've discussed on this show over 2021 in terms of NIL, transfer portal, the alliance, Oklahoma and Texas going to the SEC, and then just what 2021, two of the best in the business. So if you guys get a chance, go check it out. Great stuff.
Jason, I appreciate that. Yes, that was nice to have Josh Pate from Late Kick 247 Sports join us today, as well as Phil Steele. And that's a whole lot of fun to have those conversations. And speaking at the national scene, Jason will have his top 25 unveiled a little bit later in the show. But let's get back to the Sooners, and let's start on the field with a position that has suddenly become more of a concern. Not necessarily at the very top of the depth chart because they've got two very capable, talented running backs. But beyond that, the running back room has become rather thin.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly an understatement, Mark. So I think as we have kind of just unpacking this, just overall, Mark, there was, I think, three areas that I had as, not necessarily concerns, but things to kind of look out for Oklahoma this year and the trajectory of what the 2020 season could look like for the Sooners. One was the running back depth. Secondarily to that was the offensive line and just how that was able to come together. And then, and lastly, it was a little bit of the secondary replacing a couple of starters that they had last year, just looking at what the depth looks like. So early on in fall practice, I think, into where we're at today, I think to a certain extent, I think two of those questions have been answered. The offensive line seems to be solidifying itself. Riley seems to be very pleased with where they're at. Specifically their front five, their starting five, and then the depth behind that seems to be a little bit more talented than maybe not necessarily what they expected, but certainly coming off of what they were last year. And then the depth in the secondary, I think they've got a lot of good kids that they're 5 or 6 guys that I think that'll play a lot. So when you move to the running back, certainly that is a position specifically from a depth perspective that Oklahoma has just had all kinds of bad luck. When you look at, where they were, as they ended 2020 and coming in 2021, you have Ramondre Stevenson that obviously went to the NFL draft and is playing very well early on with the Patriots. You got Seth McGowan, who is a guy along with Mikey Henderson that was that exited the program because of some off the field stuff. Then you have Marcus Major, as recently as last week, as identified as, a guy that is not going to be with the team based on academic ineligibility. And now another bombshell that kind of hit the program a couple of days ago, yesterday to be specific, was that Trey Bradford had decided to leave the Oklahoma program. So I think your point is well taken, Mark. I think the top two are solid, and I think you could probably put that against any top two in the country, right? But I think the fact that Oklahoma has only two scholarship running backs brings about a ton of concern. Specifically going back since 2015. 2015 was the last season that Oklahoma has had their top two running backs play every single game throughout the season. So you have to account for injury. You have to account for, we're in a COVID season. Don't necessarily know, what those two kids in terms of Eric Gray and Kennedy Brooks from a vaccination perspective protocol will, could have every opportunity to miss a couple of games because of that. So I think it puts Oklahoma in a really bad situation from a depth perspective. It's almost, I know it's certainly not DeMarco Murray's fault. I know a lot of this is, kind of a bad luck situation, but I think you would be hard pressed to find anyone, specifically at the top of the rankings across the country that are in a position where they only have two scholarship running backs. So I think some of the questions come to the forefront. Where do they go from here? Because they are most certainly going to have a third running back, and certainly a fourth running back in terms of what that looks like on the field, during a game, during a season, and what that looks like. So I think a couple of different scenarios could play themselves out. So Oklahoma has two walk-on running backs. Jaden Knowles and Todd Hudson are guys that probably get the first look. I think Jaden Knowles is the guy, had a pretty good spring game. So I think he's a guy that you would probably look at that might be able to take that slack in terms of a third team guy. I think you also have Jeremiah Hall that's been in the program for quite some time. He's been more of an H-back situation. I think he is a guy that they could put in there for for a few snaps in a game type game-like situation. Other than that, if it comes to more deeper than that, I think you have some real creativity things that they'll get into. There's a couple of kids, Brian Darby, who's a wide receiver who played running back in high school. That's an option. He will probably not see the field in terms of the wide receiver rotation. There's been some thoughts about Billy Bowman possibly moving over. He played wide receiver / running back in high school, so he's a guy. However, I do think that he's kind of solidified his spot as the starting nickel kind of going into the Tulane game. So that would be something that I'm not sure that they would want to do that in terms of plucking that from the defensive side of the ball. But I think it's interesting. I think to intriguing is probably the right word, just to see exactly what they do from here, because when you think about that inherently, I think it changes a lot of things in terms of, does it change the play call? Does Oklahoma start going maybe a little bit more heavy pass, early, especially early on in the season? What do they do you got to think that they're going to do their best to protect those two kids in practice and in games to a certain extent. Do you change the way you call plays? Do you change the way you play specifically from Brooks and Gray's perspective? So I think there's a lot of, kind of intangible things that we don't necessarily look at in terms of, we got two really great running backs, but you get one or two of them hurt and you're, I think you're in a series of hurt in a hurry, so to speak. And so I think the good news coming out of this, Mark, is that they have some early season games here where they can kind of look and see what that feels like and looks like. Is a guy like Jaden Knowles ready, to come in and play and carry, maybe 5 to 10, carry the ball 5 to 10 times a game if it comes to that. So that's a benefit. And I think, the other thing is, if you have a lot of good players around you, the running back position makes it a little bit easier, especially if your offensive line is in a good spot. But I think it's certainly not something that, DeMarco Murray and the Oklahoma team overall wanted to have to deal with, but it's here and probably at the, in terms of the worst possible time, a week away from kicking off.
Yeah, so we have two really good running backs in Kennedy Brooks and in Eric Gray. And so on the surface, it appears to be just a situation where, okay, just as long as those guys stay healthy, everything's fine. We're in a precarious situation. If somebody gets hurt, then there's an issue. No, Jason has unpacked a whole lot here there are a number of angles to consider here, and you've done a great job of looking at most of it right there. A play caller wants to be in a position where he is not calling plays based on trying to protect or fail to expose a certain portion of the team. You want to be, as a play caller, especially when you're gunning for a national championship, to call the play that's best in that situation against that defense. Not, oh, we've got a bad offensive line, so I got to get the ball out of the quarterback's hands. Therefore, I'm hamstrung. I can't call 30% of my playbook. Or I only have two capable running backs that I feel real strong about playing in competitive football games. Therefore, we might go from 60-40 pass run to 75-25 pass run. All those things, or I don't want to use them as much out of the backfield as a pass receiver. We see, of course, running backs get banged up, not just carrying the football, but being pass protectors against big defensive linemen and fast edge rushers that can lay a wallop. There's a lot of things to consider here, and not knowing their comfort level as a coaching staff with the other players that you mentioned at that position, and having that option with Darby stepping in as a wide receiver based on his past experience. There's a lot of facets to it that are fascinating, not being able to necessarily, again, depending on the comfort with the third and fourth and fifth players, being able to give these guys a blow in what are routes that Oklahoma typically gets into 3 to 5 times in a season, in which they're comfortably ahead in the second half, where maybe they aren't comfortable going to those other options as early as they typically would be. And then that just provides more wear and tear and more plays to be susceptible to serious injury.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think for me, this becomes the number one most intriguing thing to watch, for this team coming into 2021 is really, to your point, exactly how does, because inherently, I think from a coaching perspective, you weigh the risks, right? In terms of, play calling, in terms of, what your strategy is coming to a given game. Exactly to your point, do you move to more of a 75-25 pass run? Do you have some of those kids that you got to see if they're ready? I mean, you don't have any other real opportunities. They've got a week until the first game. And I think even more than that, Mark, I don't have their schedule up in front of me, but I don't think Oklahoma has a bye until the either 7th, 8th, or 9th week of the season. So it's not like you have an early season bye week. I mean, certainly you can view Western Carolina as that, the second game of the year for Oklahoma. But I think outside of that, you don't really know exactly what you have and how that's going to work itself out. And so even though Riley may not say, to us, from a media perspective, that we're still going to run our offense the way we run it. We're still going to play the way we've always played. I think in the back of their mind, he's always going to be thinking of that, the way he plays, the way he practices, the way he calls plays. So, yeah, I think it'll be very, very intriguing to see what he does from a play calling perspective, what Oklahoma does just in terms of early on in the season. But I think at the very least, it puts a little bit more of a question mark on what the trajectory of this season could be for Oklahoma. Obviously, you don't want to hit the panic button too early, right? Because you have two great running backs, but if it comes down to to another situation, and in Oklahoma, I've seen a lot of comments, not only here, a couple of comments here, but just in general on social media about there's so many different kids in the transfer portal. Well, when you look at the transfer portal, it has to be grad transfer one, and to be able to have eligibility immediately. So I think that dilutes your players. And second of all, if you bring someone in, they don't know the offense, so you have to get that guy up to speed really to a certain extent on what they're doing offensively. So I would venture to guess that they'll roll with who they have right now, and I guess for those people that are just going to hold on to hope, I guess there is some hope that they could talk Bradford into coming back. I know he's left the team as of a couple of days ago. I don't know that he's officially entered the transfer portal. I think the rumors that I've heard is he was wanting to go back to LSU, and he's had some people from LSU in his ear the entire time that he had really even been at Oklahoma, which hasn't been a terrible amount of time. So yeah, I think they have the opportunity to just they'll have to use what they have, and they may have to get creative in terms of who that looks like and who Oklahoma has in terms of a contingency.
I was trying to do the complicated math here, and when I say complicated, I mean complicated for me. It's just a lot of addition to try to get a run-pass ratio in looking at last year's stats where they threw the ball. I can do this math 362 times, and it appears doing the quick math that they ran it just about as many times, but also keep in mind that Rattler ran it 81 times, and I got to think that most of those were not designed runs, so they probably called at least 60% passes.
Yeah, no, I think, and you'll certainly see that change. I think a little bit this year. I think we would have seen it. I think there was a question, last week about that as well, even before this kind of happened. And I think you'll see that to a certain extent this year, because I think Oklahoma, even before this happened with Bradford, and even Major to that extent, I think Oklahoma felt a little bit better about their wide receiver core from a depth perspective. So, and then certainly having a guy like Spencer Rattler back there helps that from being able to, to throw the ball around a little bit more. So, maybe you put more of a load on Rattler in terms of throwing the football. But I think Oklahoma certainly loves the idea of being balanced from that perspective. So yeah, like I said, I mean, they've got a lot of different options they could look at, whether it's Jeremiah Hall, whether it's and another option to think about is Caleb Williams. He's a guy, obviously you don't want to get your quarterback hurt that much, but could you put him maybe even in the backfield, or even split him out wide and get him a couple of carries here and there. So I think you could see some unconventional things, but I think and I just Mark, just kind of thinking of this, I put myself in Riley's shoes a little bit. Like, how do you approach practice, even game? You almost have to feel like almost every play you're holding your breath to a certain extent, knowing kind of knock on wood here, knowing that any of these kids that you've lost thus far, not a single one of them has been an injury. So it's all been, off the field transfer, academic type of stuff. And so you've been lucky and been blessed in the fact that you don't have any injuries that you've had through. But now again, if injuries do come, now you're in a really bad situation.
I think sometimes we look at passing and catching the football as a skill set, and a lot of other things like blocking and tackling. And while we bring up tackling, we'll bring up breaking tackles as more of an effort thing. That, okay, let's keep them safe during practice. Just throw the ball around, a lot of 7-on-7, just go through your drills, no contact. Start week 1 against Tulane and let them run on the field. And now they got to start blocking and tackling people with some intent. Well, it's not that easy. It is a skill to tackle somebody. Therefore, I got to, we don't typically think of it this way, but I've got to think that it's a skill to break tackles. And so it requires some level of practice, some amount of practice and reps at full speed or near full speed of hitting the other guy to prepare yourself to hit other guys in the season. And again, not just say, okay, well, we're just going to rest guys and not let them hit each other so we stay healthy. There's a balancing act to it, and I think obviously that coaches have leaned more toward the safety route to keep their teams fresh than they did in years gone by. But still, there is an art to tackling, breaking tackles, blocking, doing physical acts in football that require practice.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Mark. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think. Yeah, it's such a tough balancing act, but you've got to you've got to practice football to be ready for football on Saturdays. So, I mean, I think that's, we see that a lot in terms of, there's not as much live tackling in practice and scrimmages that we've probably seen before. And I think that's, at a high level, why maybe the tackling fundamentally speaking hasn't been quite as good, across the country, not necessarily at Oklahoma, but just across the country. So, kind of, finishing this up, I think for Tulane, you'll probably see Knowles as your third team, running back. And one of the things that you had on here on the screen a minute ago, Jimmy had mentioned that maybe not necessarily ideal to have a guy like Jeremiah Hall go, because look, you're thin there too at the H-back tight end position. You've got Jeremiah Hall, you've got Braden Willis, and you've got Austin Stogner as your guys. You probably have Jackson, someone that they could bring in, as well as another guy that played well in the spring. But yeah, like I said, I think this is going to be the biggest thing that I'll be watching for early on, because granted, you should be able to, against no disrespect to Tulane, but what Oklahoma has from a roster's perspective, you probably would be able to go in there with a couple walk-on running backs and still play fairly well. So, but I think, when it comes to Nebraska and TCU and then West Virginia and Texas coming up, those are guys you have to have another guy that's going to be ready.
The case in point that I can think of was just at this point last year. In the first game of the season, Navy played BYU, and the Navy coach, Ken Niumatalolo, had decided, because of COVID concerns, not to have his players hit each other, block tackle, during practice. And Navy's not a horrible football team. They're typically going to bowl games and winning 7, 8, 9 ball games a year. They went out there, and I think the final score was 55-3, and it wasn't that close.
Right.
They looked like they were not interested in tackling, and that has nothing to do with the character or discipline of a Navy football team. Of course, we know that. It's to some degree a skill. You have to practice tackling, and they looked like they had never tackled in their lives.
No, absolutely. And that was when you were talking about that, when you said Navy, I instantly remembered that. And just, and I believe that they had, I think they were maybe an 8 or 9 win team in 2019, at least a 7-win team. And then coming into that, they had a lot of.
They won 11-2, actually.
11? Okay. I was going to say, I knew that they were on the verge of a double digit win season if they didn't. And coming into that game, I believe it was only a 3 or 4 point spread, maybe a 7-point spread at the most. So, coming into that game to start the year last year, I think that was, I think a lot of us had that one circled on our calendar as an entertaining game that we wanted to see. And yeah, it looked like, they hadn't practiced at all. And there's a risk reward, obviously, that you have, that you have with that. Perfect example off the, I think sports is a very repetitive thing that you have to do over and over to be very good at it. Case in point, I coach high school basketball on the side, and we had a couple of situations where last year we had to sit out a couple of weeks because of COVID protocol stuff, and then we would come back, and a couple of times we played a game a day after just coming back. And we played awful those 2 games, or those couple of games when we came back from that. So it's the same principle here. You don't do something for a period of time, and you inherently lose that skill, or that skill is a little bit rusty. So you still, at the very least, you still got to be able to play and practice to a certain extent what you're going to do on Saturdays.
Oklahoma Football Talk here every Friday, but we've got an announcement to make. We are changing times for our in-season schedule. So starting next week, we will hit you up at every Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern time, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central, 11:30 in the morning Central time every Wednesday. So mark it down. And of course, if you are subscribed, then if you've got the notifications turned on, you've got nothing to worry about. You won't miss our live Oklahoma Sooners show each and every week with Jason and myself. All right. Anything else from the camp scene over the last week that's been of note?
Just a few things, Mark. I think more and more the coaches are getting just extremely excited about Caleb Williams. I think just looking at him as a guy who is approaching every single day as if this is an open quarterback competition, and I know that probably inherently he knows it's not, and I think openly, everyone else around him knows it's not, but he's a guy that I've been told increasingly that Oklahoma, the coaches, would have very little concern if Rattler happened to go down or miss a game or whatever it might be. From that comfortability perspective, certainly would see him playing in his 4 games, maybe a little bit more, depending on how the season kind of goes forward. I think the last scrimmage that they had, no drops whatsoever from the wide receivers, so I think that's encouraging based on specifically how they played in 2020. I think there's a lot of good battles. Riley even specifically talked about it in terms of offensive line versus defensive line, and he was very kind of poignant in his comments, Mark, when he had talked about a couple of years ago when we would look at offensive line versus defensive line, there was a huge talent disparity between what Oklahoma had historically on the offensive line and the defensive line. And he said last year was starting to be, not necessarily the case. And this year, he said the battle has just been, really exciting when they're ready to go, when they're when they're motivated, when they're on their game. Both sides, there's been a lot of good battles. The first couple of scrimmages they've seen the offense kind of take control a little bit early on, and then the defense kind of rallies and kind of shuts them down a little bit more towards the end of the scrimmages and the practice. So I think that's a good sign on both sides of the ball, honestly. So I think they're happy with their 5 that they've got on the offensive line. I think they've got about 8 or 9 total that they feel comfortable playing. Riley even said he felt like maybe offensive line is a little bit more talented than they've seen since probably the 2018 season. So that's certainly something that's positive to look at. Defensively, they've been pretty. I think they've been pretty consistent, pretty stout. I still feel like they've got that 10 to 14 kids in terms of the the defensive line that they'll probably play. I'm not sure if they'll get to the 14 mark, but I think they've got 10 that are really solid. So a couple of freshmen that I've heard that, a lot of times, Mark, you'll hear freshmen kind of flash early on in camp, and then, maybe as the playbook gets a little bit deeper and they get into scrimmage time, that they, that they kind of hit that proverbial freshman wall. I think there's two freshmen that specifically are going to play a lot. Danny Stutzman at the linebacker position. Wouldn't be surprised from people that I've talked to if he actually even starts, which is incredible. I think he's really kind of in the mold of a Teddy Lehman, Rocky Kalmus type of linebacker for Oklahoma. So certainly he'll be in the 2 deep if he's not a starter. But, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Billy Bowman, everything that I've heard says that he's grabbed that starting nickel spot. And I think one of the things that's very interesting for him coming in as a true freshman, being able to start in a swing position for Oklahoma, that's something that Alex Grinch and his defense asks his nickelback to do a lot. So I think for him to go in and grab that job as a true freshman, kind of speaks dividends to him, specifically the talent upgrade that Oklahoma's had, not only in the secondary, but overall across across that. And I think Jeremiah Cradell's been a little bit banged up, through fall, so he's taken a little bit of an advantage of that. But I think, everything that he'll be a factor not only at the nickelback, but I think he'll probably be a factor in returning kicks as well.
Folks, I hope you were able to join Jason for his live stream the other day upon the news of Marcus Major. Jason struck up the live stream. I jumped in here for several minutes, and man, after checking out Jason's work when he jumps on here live, and I was excited to see the live update on Marcus Major and Jason going live. Then I was like, why in the world does he keep me around? Why am I showing up here every Friday? What good do I do? So we look forward to that, which leads me into this. I'm excited to see Jason's work on the Oklahoma postgame show. So starting with the Tulane game, and we'll get to the variables concerning that situation that could be in play. But as it stands right now, Oklahoma Tulane, of course, on September 4th, opening Saturday of college football. And Jason's going to be here right after the game to talk about Oklahoma's effort against the Green Wave. All right, Oklahoma. Jason, I guess that brings us to the possibilities, unfortunately. And we see this almost every year in college football in September, because that is hurricane season. So those games that are scheduled along the East Coast, along the Gulf Coast, are sometimes in danger. And we have a hurricane that is headed toward the New Orleans area. I don't know where exactly it's targeted at this point, but this Sunday, and of course, Oklahoma slated to play Tulane next Saturday, 6 days later. There could be a number of decisions that need to be made depending on what facilities are like and roadways and everything else in the path of this storm.
Yeah, so Mark, we talked a little bit about this off camera, but just something I've been following. A couple of days ago, I heard that it was, it looked like it could be happening, and then it looks like maybe it's intensified a little bit over today, and I think there's more. I wouldn't say doom and gloom, but I think there's more thoughts that this could certainly have an impact, and yeah, I think it's supposed to go. I think Hurricane Ida, I believe, is the name, and I think it's supposed to hit landfall somewhere between Saturday night and Sunday morning. So I think one of the things I heard that I think Tulane and Oklahoma will both collectively make a decision at some point Sunday. I think one of the other things that I've heard that it looks like there could be another storm on top of it coming behind that, which is midweek, and maybe that's. Don't have a whole lot of details as far as that goes, but yeah, no, I mean, a couple of options that could certainly. This is something that no one wants to see. One option is just canceling the game altogether. Oklahoma has, I believe, in 2024, they have another game against Tulane, which is supposed to be in Norman. They certainly could do that. They could make that switch and have 2024 have the return trip to New Orleans, and certainly could move the game to Norman if they would like to do that. But yeah, something to keep an eye on. Probably, I would assume with travel and flights and logistical type things, I think we would have an idea of what that looks like. Sunday night, early Monday morning for next week.
And it's certainly not unprecedented for a big-time college football program to only play an 11-game schedule here. Talking recently, of course, there were 11-game schedules back in the 70s and 80s. But I know Miami played an 11-game schedule just a couple of years ago. They missed a game due to hurricane conditions. A UCF Georgia Tech game got canceled, never made up. LSU and Florida. LSU was an interesting case. 2 consecutive years, I believe. 1 year, they just missed the game. It was a non-conference game that they just canceled. So they played an 11-game season. The next year was the week of the Florida game that there was a threatening hurricane. And because of it being a conference game that needed to be played, they actually just switched the location. And LSU and Florida had very unbalanced schedules that year because they picked up an extra road game because LSU had to move to Florida to play the game, to play an extra road game. So they actually played 3 home games and 5 road games in the SEC that year, and then they just repaid it the next year. So they played an unbalanced schedule the next year as well. So hopefully we do see Tulane and Oklahoma get together when they're supposed to, and if not, maybe possibly play that game in Norman this year. And the return trip, as Jason says, is in 2024. Jimmy's asking about the post game, and I just want to give Jason the opportunity just to let you know what he has in store and what time you can expect him.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think Jimmy's talking about this Saturday. So I thought about maybe we'll do one at 11 a.m. this Saturday, just get everybody ready. I know a lot of Oklahoma eyes will be on in Champaign, Illinois, watching Nebraska against Illinois. So we'll do that at 11 a.m. this Saturday. But as far as the post-game show, I think what we'll try to do is certainly do that as quickly as possible after the game concludes every single week. This first game, kind of depending on what happens, it might be a little bit later, maybe an hour or so after the game, as opposed to immediately after, since all, God willing, we'll be in attendance for that game. But we'll be sure to make everybody aware on the notification within the team. So make sure everybody hits that like and subscribe button so that you get those notifications. But typically, I think we'll go no more than like 15 to 30 minutes after the game concludes.
Got Jimmy on the line wondering about Wanye Morris. Of course, keep in mind that we only have so much access to any reports of player development, how they're doing, videotape there from practice. But any word on Wanye Morris in particular?
Yeah, so I think he's doing well. Asking a lot of questions, still getting used to the way Oklahoma does things. So he's battling with Anton Harrison in terms of that left tackle spot. I think early on, what I kind of heard in camp, that Tyrese Robinson was working at the right tackle position a little bit more with Chris Murray, working at that guard position. So I think that kind of remains to be seen. I think Chris Murray will be one of your starters at guard, along with Marquise Hayes. But I think it looks like Tyrese Robinson might have taken over that right tackle spot. So I think he's still in the back. He'll still play a lot, Mark, no matter what. I'm not sure if he'll be a starter as of yet. I think that's a really close battle between him and Anton Harrison. He's another kid that's been a little bit banged up in camp. But I would say, while we're talking about the offensive line here, one of the things that I've heard is that Chris Murray, we talked a lot about him at center. It sounds like he's really made a home at guard, and he is playing extremely well in terms of in fall camp. So I think the part that he struggled with a little bit, early on in spring, was kind of the mental side of things for playing that center position. So his move to guard, I think, has been a really fruitful one for him, and also Andrew Raym moving over to center. I think that's a lineup that they've found that's been kind of mutually advantageous for both of those kids, and that he's played really well. So I think you honestly got the middle of your offensive line between Andrew Raym, Marquise Hayes, and Chris Murray pretty much solidified. I think the tackles are the spots that maybe a little bit up for grabs from a competition perspective.
Jeremy, we appreciate you being here, and everybody else here in the live chat. This is our Oklahoma show that we present each and every week. We're moving to Wednesday starting next week. So Wednesday at 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern, every Wednesday. Mark it down. Be ready. Be right here. And again, Jason's going to go live, as he just outlined, coming up this Saturday and throughout the season after every Oklahoma game. So Jason did outline the Brooks and Gray tandem and how they're all alone at this point to a certain extent in regards to scholarship running backs. Of course, there's other running backs on the squad from a walk-on standpoint. So Jason has addressed that. Is there anything else you want to so Jeremy, I would just ask that you would certainly wait for the video to post, and you can catch what you missed in regards to the running back situation.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would say from a prediction perspective, if one of them gets hurt, I think Jaden Knowles was probably the next guy that we would see. I think Todd Hudson is another guy that could play some as well, but I think if they get a really bad situation, they may consider moving Jeremiah Hall over there. I think those are the three most likely contingencies that you see, especially early on in the season.
Trap House Boomin is saying that Caleb Kelly seems to be getting reps both inside and outside.
He is. No, that was one of the things that was very interesting, kind of listening to some of the commentary this week, that they're moving him around a little bit. And I think it's one of those things that they try some of those kids outside at different, those linebackers at some of the different positions, just to see exactly what they have. Do they have a guy that might be able to help them out a little bit more. I think Caleb Kelly's probably most likely running with the twos in terms of kind of that inside linebacker position. So yeah, outside, not that outside is any better from a depth perspective, but if they like him, maybe rushing the passer a little bit more, that could be an option for him. And one of the things, Mark, I'd forgotten, we haven't really talked about this kid a lot, but Jamar Kane was talking about Reggie Grimes, who's a guy that he's a sophomore this year, played sparingly last year as a freshman. He was a guy that really kind of I had heard that kind of hit a little bit of a wall in fall, and then over the last week and a half has something happened, something clicked, whatever it was, and he has just been tearing it up. So I think he's a guy that maybe a lot of people think that at the end of this year we'll talk the same way about a Reggie Grimes that talked about Nick Benito last year. That's pretty high praise coming from a guy that hasn't really played a whole lot, but I think that's kind of the same context in which they're talking about him right now.
Talking Oklahoma football with all of you each and every week. And again, we're moving to Wednesday, so mark it down, 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern. Jason's going to be on the line with all of you on a Saturday as well. It's prediction time in a number of ways. I'm releasing predictions on the main channel team by team, so check those out. We also have Jason included with other media members on Patreon. So if you go to Patreon, search Mark Rogers TV, or you can go down into the description section and grab the link. Go to Patreon, search Mark Rogers TV, and you get my weekly predictions, which I guess weren't good enough. So I've added 20 media members, and they're going to unveil their predictions week by week here throughout the college football season, as well as a number of other features there on Patreon at the Voice of College Football Community. All right. Jason released his Big 12 predictions right here on the show last week. He had Kansas battling it out with Baylor for the Big 12 championship. No, you gotta check out the predictions just in case. You never know. So maybe Jason's throwing a wild card at us. We'll see. So check out the predictions on the Big 12 from Jason last week, and now Jason is unveiling his top 25. Are you ready to roll here, Jason?
Yes. No, I'm
righty.
All right.
Do you want to start from the bottom?
Yeah, we can start from the bottom.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay. So as you guys know, we unveiled our top 25, Mark and I, together early on in the spring, and after a lot of intel and a lot of there's some that probably didn't move that much, and there's some that moved a little bit more. So again, this is where I see them right now. These teams right now, not the trajectory of the season or what could or could not happen based on their schedule. This is really kind of my thoughts initially. So at number 25, I have Louisiana return, I believe, 10 starters on offense. Levi Lewis is, I believe, at least a three-year starter at the quarterback position. They play in a conference that allows them to have a lot of success. So Louisiana starts at number 25 for me, facing Texas early on in the season. Number 24, I have Arizona State. I know they have some of the recruiting stuff that's looming over the program just in general. Jaden Daniels, one of the best quarterbacks, maybe that a lot of people don't necessarily know about in the country. So I think Arizona State has an opportunity to be a lot better. If you guys go and watch Mark's interview with Josh Pate from Late Kick, they talk a lot about the Pac-12. Not only this year, but historically, I think the Pac-12 will be a lot better this year than they have been traditionally, at least over the last few years. Number 23, I have Texas, down a little bit from where I had them, kind of in the preseason. I believe I had them in the spring, I should say. I believe I had them top 20. I think for me, what's a little bit of concerning, just looking at Texas, the fact that they haven't named the quarterback, and I don't know if that's Sark trying to keep that close to the vest a little bit with Louisiana and Arkansas looming early, or if it's just one of the two. Hudson Card, Casey Thompson has not solidified themselves as that guy as of yet. So given a week, just a week out before their first game, that concerns me a little bit on the outside looking in, and I think the wide receiver depth is a little bit of a concern as well for them. So I've got them just on the edge here at number 23. Number 22, I have Indiana. Michael Penix Jr. His health coming back into the 2021 season, I think, is a big, is a big indicator exactly how good of a season they have. They got a couple of tough tests early on. I believe they go to Iowa the first game of the year. They host Cincinnati in the non-conference as well. So the Indiana could be a team this year that is a little bit better. However, their schedule may be a little bit more difficult for them coming into the 2021 season. And number 21, I have Washington. I think they're going to be much improved defensively. I think they have a schedule that sets themselves up, especially in conference play. Big non-conference game at Michigan. Both of those teams are, that could be a game, Mark, that you see the winner of that game kind of bolster them through the conference season between Washington and Michigan, which I believe is the third week of the season. Then we go at number 20, Coastal Carolina, incredibly talented team. One of the best, offensive and defensive teams from a mid-major perspective. At number 20, return almost everyone from a year ago. Their set schedule again sets up fairly well for them. Although they do have a very tough test early on against Kansas. I'm not at home, so that'll be something to look at for them. But yeah, no, I think they have an opportunity to go undefeated, once again in the regular season like they did last year. And I got Utah at number 19. Utah is a team that I like a lot. I think in the coaches poll, Mark can probably correct me here. I think in the coaches poll, they're unranked. If I remember right, in the AP, they're towards the bottom. But I think Utah is a team that I like a lot. Traditionally they've struggled from a downfield passing perspective, but I think that having Brewer as part of that team coming over from Baylor this year, I think will help in that perspective. TJ Pledger coming over, it's a team that's gotten really a lot better through the transfer portal. So I think that's a team that could very easily be your Pac-12 champion this year, or at the very least play in that Pac-12 championship game. At 18, I have Florida down a little bit from a lot of other folks. I'm not sold. Not sold on Emory in terms of the quarterback perspective. I've heard some things just in terms of the offensive line that's a little bit troubling early on in the season. I've heard some, that they're kind of going from a skill set perspective, going more towards what you would have seen kind of in a Tim Tebow type of Florida offense, more of a kind of a ground and pound, offensive philosophy for Florida, but not sure they've got what it takes to be there. And 18 is not bad. Probably a 9-3, 8-4 season's what I'm looking at for Florida here. Number 17, I have Iowa. I think a lot of Iowa, what they have kind of falls on the the right hand of the quarterback. I think they played, they struggled the first couple of games, and then they ended in a very strong way this past year. They've, like we talked about earlier, with Indiana, they have a tough matchup early on in the year. If they've got two really tough games, so I think the trajectory of their season, Mark, really is going to be big in terms of that game against Indiana and then against Iowa State the next week. And then number 16, I have Penn State. If you've listened to Josh at all, he's got Penn State in his top 10. Not quite that high, but I think they're going to be much more improved this year. Certainly could see a 9 and potentially a 10-win season at the Penn State. But I think that's a team that is going to be much better than they were last year. Number 15, I have Miami. When you look at Miami, very similar to how you look at Indiana, just in terms of how healthy is that quarterback coming into the season. In this case, De'Aaron King. Certainly, you have a lot of talent on the offensive side of the ball. At skill positions, I think the question for them has been defensively. How are they able to stop Are they able to stop some of these other teams, especially in the ACC? Comes early on with Alabama. I know that we'll get into some discussion like that. Discussion early next week, but I think that game has the opportunity to be closer than a lot of people think that it will be starting the season. So Miami at 15, USC at 14. I think offensively they've got tons of weapons. Keaton Slovis, they've got Keontae Ingram in terms of that transfer from Texas. So I think they have the opportunity. I think the big thing is, do you trust the head coach? Do you trust him to be able to get USC back to where they were? Do they have an opportunity to get into that playoff discussion? It's certainly a team that could, but it kind of remains to be seen. But they're loaded with talent all across the offensive side of the ball. LSU at number 13. I think LSU is. I'd like to see them be much more improved than they were last year. I think you've got you've got a team that showed some signs late in the year last year in terms of their improvement, just in terms of specifically that win against Florida and some things. I think they'll take a little bit of a step forward. Not sure exactly if they're in the class of are they quite in the class of a Texas A&M and certainly in Alabama and a Georgia? Not sure that they're quite there, quite yet, but I think they'll be much improved in that top 15. Number 12, I have Wisconsin. I think what's intriguing about them is Graham Mertz the guy that we saw the very first game of this season that just completely lit up Illinois, or is he the kid that came after post-COVID and just really wasn't the same guy? So, I think their schedule sets up very well for them to certainly win that side of the conference and maybe facing Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. I think certainly they'll battle Iowa for that title on that side of the Big Ten. At number 11, I have Notre Dame. I know there's watching your show, Mark, and seeing some of the other folks around the country. Maybe there's some two ways to look at Brian Kelly naming Jack Cohen the quarterback early on in the season, or early on in the fall camp. Is it the guy? Is he just that much better than everyone else? Some of the younger kids, or is it just kind of a lack of talent that they've had there? So got Notre Dame at number 11, just outside of the top 10, but I think they have an opportunity to get there, certainly. So as we get into the top 10, I got Cincinnati at number 10. I think if Cincinnati is a team that can go undefeated, then I think we'll see them in the college football playoff this year. So I think it kind of, it does have an opportunity to kind of dispute the fact that there's not a path for a G5 team, to make it to the playoff in the current structure. Now, a win against Notre Dame, a win against Indiana, away from Cincinnati, speaks dividends in terms of what they would be able to do. They've got UCF in the conference slate, which seems to be probably their only hurdle there. So Cincinnati there to start off the top 10. Oregon at number 9. I think, Mark, maybe they're a quarterback away from being a perennial national championship contender. I think they've got loads of talent at the running back, at the wide receiver position as well. Defensively, I think they'll be the best defensive team Oregon has had since in maybe forever. I think Kayvon Thibodeau is one of the best defensive players in the country overall. So I think they've got a lot of pieces. I think it remains to be seen if Anthony Brown can be that guy, or does one of their true fresh or the redshirt freshmen come in and make that jump for a starter. So I think they'll start with Anthony Brown and just kind of certainly see how that works in game 1 against Fresno State, and it's got to be ready. Whoever that is got to be ready in game 2 as they go to the horseshoe. At number 8, I have North Carolina. I think a lot of I think the good thing, when you look at the good thing about North Carolina, certainly Sam Howell, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, may be the best quarterback in the country. And then you've got all 5 offensive linemen returning. I think the big question mark for them is at the skill position. Ty Chandler comes over from from Tennessee. I think he's going to shoulder the load. I think from some of the things that I've heard, I think that they're very, very intrigued, very happy with what they have going on at the wide receiver position. So big game for them to start the season, go to Blacksburg to face Virginia Tech. So they're a team that I think has the opportunity to at least challenge Clemson in the ACC. Not sure if they'll be there, but we'll certainly get that question answered during the totality of this year. And number 7, I have Iowa State. Again, really haven't changed my view of them from the spring to where we're at now. I think they are certainly loaded at both sides on both sides of the ball. They don't have a lot of. I think that the big question mark is Brock Purdy able to make the jump to be an elite quarterback in college football. I think he's a really good quarterback. Can he be elite? I think the things that you saw in the Big 12 championship game in terms of him turning the ball over, 3 interceptions against Oklahoma, can he cut those mistakes out in a big game? Certainly played much better against Oregon in the Fiesta Bowl. So I think they're right there again. Really early season tough matchup against Iowa. How do they deal with how do they deal with everybody patting them on the back? How do they deal with the notoriety being preseason top 10 for the first time in program history? Number 6, Texas A&M, recently named Haynes King as the starting quarterback. I think they've got one of the best defenses in the country, certainly the SEC. Offensive line is probably the biggest question mark. They've got 4 guys that they're replacing. You hear that possibly they might be even better than last year with some of those kids that are coming in. But I think they are obviously your number one legitimate challenger to Alabama in the SEC. So going into our top 5. So number 5, I know that we have Georgia listed here twice. I have Oklahoma at number 5. So no worries. This is a kind of a late change for us, and really the difference here, and just I know we'll probably get the comments will start lighting up here. But so as I look at this today, I'm not sure exactly what the rotation will be from the running back perspective. Can Eric Gray, can Kennedy Brooks stay healthy? If they can, then I think Oklahoma's more in the range of a 2 or a 3. If they can't, if Oklahoma starts getting into a position where they're going to have to look at some depth issues, how does Lincoln Riley change the offense? Do they play a little bit differently? What does that look like? So as the season goes on, I could certainly see moving Oklahoma back up to that 2 and 3 area. But as of right now, I have to have Oklahoma at number 5, really in just an uncertain situation for the running back position. Number 4, I have Ohio State, and I think that there's no additional questions. I'm more convinced that they're going to be fine on the offensive side of the ball. C.J. Stroud is a guy that I think is going to be fine. Offensively, I think the wide receiver position is the deepest in the country, and the most talented in the country. I think defensively, there's some questions in the linebacker and the secondary position for Ohio State, but I think those are the only 2 areas, and I'm not sure specifically early on and maybe late in the season if there's anyone in the Big Ten that's going to be able to challenge them vertically. Certainly Oregon may be able to do that, but in conference play, I don't know that I have a lot of confidence in anyone that's able to challenge them. Maybe a Penn State could do that, but early on, I think they'll be able to kind of shoulder the load until they get maybe a little bit more solidified in that back 7 of the defense. Number 3, I have Georgia.
Oops.
Oh, go ahead, Mark. Oh, okay. Number 3, I have Georgia. I think top to bottom, they could be the most talented team in the country. Some of the injuries that I've seen and heard about early on in the year, in fall camp, I should say, are a little bit concerning in the secondary, and then certainly Eric Gilbert's away from the team, I believe, still. Just because of some personal issues that he's having off the field. So I think a couple of those things that I was, really almost prepared to have them number 1 going in. I think I put them back a little bit just because of some of the injuries I've seen early on. Number 2, I have Clemson. And again, for you guys watching, I think I feel so strongly, and I think he put the Josh Pate put the nail on the head, or hit the nail on the head, just in terms of the competitive balance that we've seen, maybe even within the top 5 is not the same as what we've always seen in the past. So I think Oklahoma and Clemson certainly could be interchangeable, and what that looks like. The concern that Oklahoma has at the running back position, I think Clemson has that same concern at the quarterback position. If DJ goes down, I think you've got a lot of problems behind them. So I think if you look at those 2 positions, I think they're very interchangeable. You could certainly make a case where Oklahoma's still number 2 and Clemson is still number 5, or is number 5, or even lower in that because of that. But I think they'll be fine they've got great running backs. They've got a lot of good wide receivers. Defensive line is going to be one of the best in the country, if not the best in the country. So I think they'll be fine defensively. So it's just a matter, can they stay healthy on the offensive side of the ball? And offensive line, they've gotten a little bit, they've gotten exposed to a certain extent in some of those playoff games. A couple specifically they did last year against Ohio State. So what does that look like? Again, very much similar to the discussion that we have with Ohio State is, do they have anyone on their schedule outside of the initial game against Georgia that's going to challenge their offensive line early? I don't think so. Even probably more so on Clemson's side than Ohio State. And number 1, I have Alabama still, and I just have Alabama just from a respect perspective. Not to say that I think that they belong at number 5, but a team that has been able to churn out talented seasons year in and year out. I think you've got to put them at number 1 from my perspective, just because of what they've done. I think you look at them; they'll be a little bit different, especially early on. I think they'll rely on their defense a little bit more than they maybe have in the past. Mark, I think they're stronger on the defensive side of the ball than they've been in the last couple of years, and that's saying a lot. I think they gave up about 19 points a game last year, still a top 20, top 30 defense. However, I think they're a little bit better on the defensive side of the ball, and so I think that they're going to look at relying on the defense to carry them, maybe to a certain extent, maybe not necessarily carry them, but because I think that offense will sputter just a little bit early on. I think just to expect them to roll out there and be dominant early on and be as good as they were last year, I think is unreasonable. Now, certainly, I think they could get there by midseason, but I watch out for that. Watch out for the game, certainly against Miami, but watch out for Florida in week 3, and I think week 6 they go to Texas A&M. So, can they be solidified enough offensively by then? You would probably think so. Certainly not at the level that they were last year, but I think good as they need to be in terms of how good that defense is going to be.
Jason's top 25 to begin the season, and while the Clemson-Georgia matchup in particular, but also UCLA and LSU and the Alabama-Miami matchup are gaining most of the attention, and that's understandable. Number 1, that Georgia-Clemson game, you're involving 2 top 5 teams, and the other ones are interesting from the standpoint of seeing teams play that don't normally play. 3 of the games that stand out to me, especially, and it comes to mind when I look at your rankings, are 3 games involving kind of tier 2 to tier 3 teams that are matched up in week 1. And 2 of them are conference games, and it's really an opportunity for one of those 2 teams, the winner of that game, to make a statement, to take on a really good team and to say, maybe we've separated ourselves and we can challenge the elite in this conference. And those games are Penn State and Wisconsin play Camp Randall Stadium in week 1. And so you've got 2 teams ranked depending on your poll. And if you're looking at Jason's right now, 12-16 in the nation. So even though December's a long ways away, who's going to take that first step toward getting a spot in Indianapolis? And that's a huge barrier, a huge game for each one of them not to get that first loss in the loss column, because you can't have too many of those if you want to make the conference championship game. It's usually 2 max. The other one like that, of course, in conference play in the Big Ten is Iowa, Indiana. So it's a huge week in the Big Ten. And again, Iowa, Indiana, very close to each other, regardless of your rankings. And we'll get to see which team, at least at this stage of the season, is a cut above the other regarding teams that are very much in that same category that we really don't know who's better. Somebody's going to make a statement. And then that Louisiana-Texas game. It's a group of 5, but Texas in for all it can handle, certainly at home, in a game that is very much for people that say games are made by matchups. This a matchup, not necessarily a positional groups, but one program that's loaded with the tradition, the history, the facilities, the money, and the talent that's been recruited to the roster versus the true team that has played together a long time, brings back a ton of experience, a ton of productivity, leads the nation in amount of productivity coming back. And will they catch a more talented team still trying to figure things out, just having named a starting quarterback? Or will that talent and that Texas ability be able to override some of the inexperienced issues and getting acclimated to a new coaching staff and all of that? So it's a fascinating matchup from that standpoint.
Oh, it really is, Mark. And I think, you wouldn't be crazy if you said that Texas is going to start 0-2, right? I mean, in Arkansas, sort of kind of middle of the pack, maybe lower tier SEC right now. But I think some of the things that I've heard is, heard from coming out of them is, they've looked really good in fall camp. So, I think, I think Texas is going to go ahead and win those 2 games. But to your point, Mark, it could be a little bit of a struggle early on, specifically, your very first game with a new program, new installing, a new, your identity, your culture, your stamp on the program, and you have to go play a top 25 team your very first game. I think if Stark had it his way, he'd like to, have, maybe a lower tier group of 5 team, or maybe even an FCS team, just to kind of get his feet wet a little bit, kind of coming into the season. But there's no rest for the weary. So you look at that team, and they're very good. I think their starting running back is the only guy that they lost, from that 2020 season. So I think it's you have a lot of maybe not a concern, but I think you've got a lot of worry for Texas coming into those 2 tough games to start the season.
Jason, I thought you would lose some people with that number 5 ranking.
Yeah, I hope I didn't lose too many people, and it's not I don't want people to feel like this is really just an over the top overreaction. I just think there's so many dominoes that could potentially fall looking at this right now, in the running back perspective. Just looking at that, it's something that we would have to look at, Mark. I would venture to guess there would be very, very few teams in the country that only have 2 scholarship running backs on their team. So I don't want to overreact from one perspective, but the other perspective, it's undeniable that that this is going to be something that's going to be of concern at some point in the season. I had mentioned it's been 6 years since Oklahoma has had their top 2 running backs production-wise play in every single game, and that was 2015. So while it could happen, certainly it could happen. They could have both of these kids play play every single game this year and play at a very high level. And this won't be a concern, but the odds of that happening are very small.
And once again, if I heard that correctly, your top 25 is the 25 best teams in the country as it stands right now, not taking the schedule into consideration. You believe these are the 25 best teams in the country, Alabama being the best, Clemson being the second best, on down the line.
That's correct. Yeah.
That's one way to do it. People do it all over the place. And I think that most people at least approach it this way, or they perceive it this way, that that's a prediction for the end of the season. Much like I made a top 25 months and months ago that stirred some people up because they felt as though I was not considering this game and that game and this team's schedule. And I was just listing out who I believe to be the top 25 teams in the country in order, not taking the schedule into consideration. So very interesting there, as we will start to find out, of course, starting technically this Saturday involving the contenders, you would think starting the Saturday following.
Yep.
All right. A lot of talk. I will address one question, and if Jason wants to chime in as well. Somebody had asked, with, of course, Clemson and Georgia playing on week 1. Excuse me. This is a question that's been asked a number of times, and I've addressed it. Who's it? Who does a loss hurt more? Which team is this game more important for? These are my two lines of thinking. One would be that because of Clemson's schedule, Clemson does not play a ranked team in the regular season after Georgia. Things could change, but they don't see North Carolina. They don't see Miami in the regular season. They will be a double-digit favorite unless things drastically change, a double-digit favorite in every game this season after Georgia. So Clemson will certainly have a lot more opportunity to recover, meaning that they're probably not going to be threatened. Not that they can't get upset like they have in the past by Syracuse or Pitt or somebody like that. But if they lose to Georgia, they're going to be a prohibitive favorite to still run the table in the ACC and go to the championship game. So they can't afford another loss, most likely, but it's unlikely that they're going to be threatened. As opposed to Georgia, if they lose to Clemson, they're looking at a typical SEC schedule that doesn't necessarily provide challenges from teams that are considered as good as them, but I would argue a number of challenges from teams that are much better than what Clemson's going to have to face week to week. There's still going to be teams Georgia's going to be a significant favorite against, but teams like Kentucky and Florida and Auburn that are capable. And then also Georgia's going to have to deal with that SEC championship game. That's going to be Alabama, Texas A&M, or LSU. That's going to be more formidable than what Clemson has to face. I will say that as long as the loser does not lose convincingly, if they lose a classic, then they're still going to be in decent shape in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. They evaluate the play on the field. And if you lose the 38-35 game, let's say if you're Georgia and Clemson marches through the season at 13-0, then you're still going to hold your ranking.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you, Mark. I mean, I think Clemson has the better ability to bounce back from a loss, early on than Georgia does, and I don't mean it from the perspective that they can bounce back more easily in terms of the team, but I think from a schedule perspective, I think you look at that and think that Georgia, certainly they have Florida, and then they would have, I know they go to, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, I think they go to Auburn, not incredibly high on Auburn this year, but and then, you got an SEC championship game to maneuver as well. So whereas, you have Clemson, they have, and you got to stretch for some for some games that they might run into problems. Maybe at NC State might be a little bit of a problem. At Pittsburgh you could stretch that into maybe a little bit of a problem, and then towards the end of the season, if they face up with North Carolina or Miami, whoever that might be, in the ACC championship. But I think the path to a playoff is much easier for Clemson than it is for Georgia.
Talking Oklahoma football with all of you each and every week, starting next week. Mark down the time: 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central on Wednesday. Wednesday is your day for Oklahoma football starting next week, and Jason's going to go live this Saturday and then throughout the season after the Oklahoma games. So join Jason for Oklahoma post game. Hit that bell for the notifications to know when we're going live. I think we've addressed everything in the live chat. Don't see anything else of significance that we haven't talked about a number of times, including earlier in the show. So once we finish the show here, the video is going to process and post. Check it out in about 15 minutes and catch up with what you missed. All right, Jason, as always, this is only possible because of you, so I appreciate it, and have a great live stream on Saturday.
Yep, absolutely.
And absolutely, we'll see everybody back here next Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central.
All right, thanks, guys. Thanks, Mark.